Today, there are at least 6 active societies dedicated to the preservation of Lafayette's memory and honoring his work. The AFL, the Order of Lafayette in New York, the Lafayette Society of Fayetteville, North Carolina, the Massachusetts Lafayette Society, and the Lafayette Alliance in LaGrange, Georgia, and most recently, the Lafayette Trail has become a membership organization. Lafayette is one of a handful of foreigners whom Congress made an honorary citizen. There are 4 state statutorily mandated Lafayette Days. Massachusetts and New Hampshire honor Lafayette on May 20, the anniversary of his death. Virginia honors him on March 14th, the anniversary of his initial arrival in 1781 at Yorktown. And Georgia honors Lafayette on September 6th, his birthday. There will be a quiz. There are roughly 80 cities, counties, townships, and towns that take their name from Lafayette or the home he lived in from 1799 until his death, LaGrange. There are countless numbers of streets, squares, statues, and parks, as well as a mountain and a lake named for Lafayette. There are scores of Masonic temples, chapters named Lafayette Lodges. What is it about Lafayette that has generated over time such widespread and sustained recognition and commemoration of the man, his life, and his works? As perhaps you have gleaned from the title of this panel discussion, we think that the answer lies, at least in part, in the character of the man. In his book, Founders on the Founders, Word Portraits from the American Revolutionary Era, John P. Kaminsky, founder and director of the Center for the Study of the American Constitution at the University of Wisconsin and prolific author in his own right, has compiled sketches written by the founders about each other, including self-appraisals. Listed alphabetically, John Adams follows immediately after Abigail Adams. If you exclude John Adams' self-appraisals and those of Abigail, about 75% of the rest are distinctly negative. Bitter adversaries though they were, Jefferson and Hamilton seem to have shared a similar perception of Adams. Jefferson wrote to Madison on July 29, 1789, when he and Adams were still on cordial terms, this way: in regard to Adams' advocacy of an aristocratic title for the new president under the Constitution, quote, "It is a proof the more of the justice of the character given by Dr. Franklin of my friend. Quote, always an honest man, often a great one, but sometimes absolutely mad." In a letter dated July 1, 1800, Hamilton went a bit further, writing, "Dr. Franklin, a sagacious observer of human nature, drew this portrait of Mr. Adams. Quote, he is always honest, sometimes great, but often mad. I subscribe to the justness of this picture, adding as to the first trait of it, i.e. he is always honest, this qualification: as far as a man excessively vain and jealous and ignobly attached to place can be." If one pages forward to the section on Lafayette, the percentages are reversed. Exclusive of self-portraits, at least 75% of the remainder are positive. The few negatives were mostly written by John Adams. On November 7, 1777, Baron de Kalb wrote, quote, "Lafayette is a prodigy for his age. He is the model of valor, intelligence, judgment, good conduct, generosity, and zeal for the cause of liberty for this continent." On October 17, 1784, after having spent about 4 weeks with Lafayette traveling through New York State, including a week at Fort Schuyler for the treaty negotiations with the Iroquois nations, Madison wrote to Jefferson from Philadelphia. In his letter, Madison offered the following appraisal: "The time I have lately passed with the Marquis has given me a pretty thorough insight into his character. With great natural frankness of temper, he unites much address with very considerable talents, a strong thirst of praise and popularity. In his politics, he says his three hobby horses are the alliance between France and the United States, the union of the latter, and the manumission of the slaves. The two former are the dearer to him as they are connected with his personal glory. In a word, the last does him real honor as it is proof of his humanity. In a word, I take him to be as amiable a man as can be imagined and as sincere an American as any Frenchman can be, one whose past services gratitude obliges us to acknowledge and whose future friendship prudence required us to cultivate. A hobby horse in this context means a preoccupation or favorite topic. As Lafayette matured, his hobby horses became more numerous. Protection of French Protestants and other disadvantaged minorities, the rights of man as reflected in the preamble to the 1791 French Constitution that he drafted, national revolutions as a vehicle to foster the rights of man, defense and protection of European refugees like the Poles, and human rights broadly construed. As to his original hobby horses, the alliance, a strong union of the states, and manumission of the slaves, as well as his other causes as listed above, Lafayette was unwavering and consistent no matter the vicissitudes that he encountered or the trials that he suffered. Here is one remarkable example. Having fled the French radicals in 1792 and having been imprisoned in Magdeburg, Prussia on March 15, 1793, he wrote his wife's relative, Princess Adelaide Deneen, who was in exile in England, a letter, one of the few letters he was able to send from his cell. In a postscript, he wrote, "I do not know what has happened to my plantation in Cayenne," the plantation that he had purchased to try out an experiment of gradual emancipation of its slaves. "But I hope that my wife will see to it that the blacks who farm it preserve their freedom." Charles X, the reactionary Bourbon monarch who succeeded to the throne in 1824 and proceeded to lose it, had this to say of his inveterate adversary Lafayette, whom he had first known as a teenager at Versailles. "I only know of two men who have always possessed the same principles, myself and Monsieur de Lafayette, he as a defender of liberty and I as the king of the aristocracy." So as I see it, Lafayette was a complete package, but I will leave it to our esteemed panelists to unpack the character of Lafayette and tell us the lessons we can learn from him today. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Lloyd Kramer. Lloyd teaches history at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill and serves as the director of Carolina Public Humanities. He studied under Stanley Zerda at Cornell, where he obtained his PhD in 1983. He is the author of Lafayette in Two Worlds, Public Cultures and Personal Identities in an Age of Revolution, which was published by UNC Press in 1996. This is a wonderful book, which you should all read if you haven't, to understand Lafayette and his world, especially after his return to France from prison and exile in 1799. Lloyd, if you will be unmuted, you can speak. Bonnie, I think you have to unmute him. Oh.
There. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Alan. I want to begin by saying it's an honor for me to have this opportunity to discuss Lafayette with my co-panelists and with members of the American Friends of Lafayette. I know I'm speaking to a group of people who are predisposed to be interested in Lafayette. I want especially to thank Alan Hoffman and Bonnie Fritz for their work in putting this together. And as always, I want to thank Chuck Schwam because he's like an animating presence, like a star, a meteor flying through the Lafayette sky because it radiates Lafayette energy. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And I want to try to talk a little bit about my view of why Lafayette still matters? Why do we still want to engage with him? And I think one of the main reasons we want to engage with him is because his character and his life work left a legacy that we're still working through. And in some ways, we're still in a dialogue with Lafayette. Like all human beings, Lafayette had his flaws and his limitations, and he made mistakes, that's for sure. His experiences in the French Revolution were especially difficult, and he was overwhelmed in the early 1790s by the conflicts that went beyond anything he had ever faced. But even the greatest setbacks give us historical examples or lessons to think about, because when we think about a human life, failure is part of what makes that person human. And when we want to understand mistakes others have made, we also can understand ways of describing our own lives and our own mistakes. So I want to focus, though, on three aspects of Lafayette's life that I see as successful and as important. The first is I want to describe briefly his lifelong commitment to human rights. And then I want to note his attempts to mediate between different groups in times of extreme polarization. And then I want to note the ways in which he expressed personal respect for others, what we might call human decency. So I'm going to focus on these three things: human rights, life in a time of polarization, and the need for human decency. And I want to suggest that all of these aspects of Lafayette's life resonate in our own moment in 2020. So historians have long debated why Lafayette came to America in 1777. We know that Americans in the 19th century always praised his actions as disinterested and idealistic. 20th century historians like Louis Gottschalk, an excellent historian, but Louis Gottschalk was much more skeptical, tended to describe Lafayette as kind of an unhappy young man looking for a way to escape difficult situations. And I think, though, that it was Lafayette's idealized view of the American Revolution that did lead him to join the Continental Army. And he took away from the Revolutionary War a lifelong commitment to advancing the cause of human rights. And this is what I want to stress very briefly. Lafayette supported the development of constitutional institutions in both America and Europe because he believed that constitutions could protect the rights of people to participate in public life and to shape government policies. He always favored free speech, freedom of religion, a free press, and in the late 1780s, as Alan has already mentioned, he supported rights of the Protestants in France as an example of the freedom of religion. He also introduced famously that first proposal for a declaration of the rights of man and citizen in 1789. But Lafayette's support for human rights went far beyond the support for constitutional systems and freedom of speech and freedom of religion. He was one of the first Frenchmen to join the French Society of the Friends of Blacks, an anti-slavery organization that was established in France in 1788. Lafayette also developed plans to emancipate enslaved Black workers by purchasing that plantation in Cayenne that Alan just mentioned, with the goal of freeing enslaved workers so that they could live independently. And this, although this project failed, he continued to work on ideas like this, and he supported his friend Fanny Wright. She developed a comparable plan in Tennessee in 1825. So Lafayette condemned slavery and the racism that sustained slavery to the last days of his life. And he saw the racist slave system as America's greatest flaw. But he also condemned the abuse of Native peoples in America. He met with representatives of the Oneida Nation, for example, and advocated for Native people as well and harmonious relations with Native people. But I also want to note that his support for human rights also included his advocacy for independent women, women who agitated for new social and human rights. And in addition to his strong support for Fanny Wright, he defended the writings and ideas of independent women such as Germaine de Stael or the Irish writer Lady Morgan, or the Italian political activist Cristina Belgiojoso, or the famous opera star Maria Malibran. And in this last case, he actually introduced legislation to legalize divorce in France, which was illegal in the early 1830s, because he believed that a woman's right to divorce should be part of a woman's basic rights. So in all of these ways, I want to stress that Lafayette's lifelong support for the rights of people who were denied those rights gives him a legacy that we're still living with. And finally, I want to note that he also opposed imperial systems and supported people who opposed colonial occupation. He believed that all peoples had the right to national independence, and he promoted these ideas for people in North and South America, in Greece, and in Poland, and many other places. So Lafayette's support for human rights, including the rights of Black Americans and the rights of women, is number one, a crucial legacy that makes him part of our world today. The second trait I want to emphasize in Lafayette's character appears in his endless efforts to mediate between different groups of people and between polarized factions in French and American political cultures. He became influential during the American Revolution because he was mediating constantly between the French and the Americans. And he understood cultural difference, but he was able to integrate people across those cultural differences. And all of his movements for national independence were in effect multicultural movements, trying to bring people together in a common cause. But his attempts to maintain a middle way and to talk with people who were from different places also led him into the very complex attempt to mediate between the left and the right during the French Revolution, a highly polarized situation. And polarization is a dominant experience in the contemporary world, including in the United States. And he wanted to mediate between the monarchists on the right and the radical Republicans on the left to create this kind of constitutional monarchy, and he failed. In fact, he had to flee for his life. But I think this struggle and this failure is something we could engage with, and I'd like to talk about it more. What does it mean to occupy the center and also have strong beliefs? He was not wishy-washy. He was not mushy. He was not a person without opinions, but he tried to sustain a dialogue with people on both sides. And he also did the same thing in America. When he came back in 1824, 25, America was highly polarized between the supporters of Andrew Jackson and the supporters of John Quincy Adams. They hated each other about as much as political opponents have ever hated each other. And yet he somehow was able to work with people on both sides in this highly polarized world. So is this kind of strong middle position possible in the contemporary United States? This is a question that I think Lafayette poses for us today. And finally, I want to note simply that Lafayette's life carried another kind of historical example, which probably related to his firm support for human rights and his ability to mediate between people from different cultures and political values. He respected people of all social classes, all races and cultural backgrounds. To put it simply, Lafayette was never arrogant or a snob. And this respect for other people was a key reason for his achievements during the American Revolution. He did not look down on American farmers or workers or common soldiers or enslaved people. He worked respectfully with all of them in the way that most other Europeans and nobles were unable to do because of their own social snobism. And this talent for working with people of even the most modest social background was noted by French commanders such as the Comte d'Estaing, who stressed that Lafayette was comfortable with Americans of all backgrounds, no matter what they were doing, what they were eating, or even what they were drinking, including that awful grog that they would drink at their dinners. So this respect for the integrity and the values of other people was one of the reasons that critics often called him naive or ineffective or too trusting of opponents. He was someone who wanted to work with others and not dominate them. He was never like Napoleon or other authoritarian leaders in the 20th century or in our own time. His decency and respect for other people was a trait that Americans recognized and appreciated. And this is also a trait that so many people find missing in our current political culture. But Lafayette seemed to understand that no matter what institutions or ideas one might support, the processes of public life and social exchanges depend on respect for other people and on human decency. So as I reflect on Lafayette's character and historical lessons during this week of his birthday and during this moment in American history, I want to celebrate these aspects of his life. Lafayette always defended essential human rights, including the right for freedom from slavery and the rights of women to participate in the public sphere. He always tried to mediate between people in different cultures and between extremely polarized political factions. And he pursued all of these actions with a basic human decency that showed his respect for all people of all social backgrounds. These are the lessons from Lafayette's character that we can still draw upon today in our own struggles in 2020. Vive la Lafayette, and happy birthday to the Marquis.
Well, thank you very much, Lloyd. That was great. I now will introduce Paul Spalding. Paul, who obtained his PhD from Yale Divinity School, I just learned that recently, actually, recently retired from his post as professor of religion at Illinois College in Jacksonville, Illinois, where he also taught history, political science, and philosophy. He is the author of Lafayette, Prisoner of State. This is a wonderful book, and just to give you a sampling of it, I will quote from two blurbs, one by Lloyd and one by myself, for his great work. And I'll give you just a sentence. Lloyd said, "This carefully researched book provides a definitive account of the least known period of Lafayette's long life." And I said, in my blurb, Spalding captures Lafayette, who had lived an almost frenetically activist life, as he heroically copes with mind-numbing and body-weakening confinement, from which he emerges principles intact and completely unbowed. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Paul Spalding.
Thank you, Alan, and I hope the audio is on. Can I be heard? Great, okay. I do want to thank our president, Alan Hoffman, for initiating this in a time of COVID where we were not able to meet for the annual meeting. And I want to thank, of course, Bonnie for hosting and all the many things that my co-panelists are contributing. I would like to take up Lloyd's #1 legacy attributed to Lafayette, and I would especially like to draw my illustrations from the lowest period in Lafayette's life, the time, 7 years in which he was a captive, living in a series of cells in Central Europe, and then as an exile along the northern coastland of Europe. Hardly any one of us would deny that Lafayette showed strength of character in selfless, courageous, persistently hopeful devotion to liberty and justice. He came to live for what he saw as universal human rights undergirded by a constitutional order. This vision, kind of a secular vision of the kingdom of God, for which he hoped and worked relentlessly, was what he would eventually call his, quote, steadfast political religion, a matter for him of ultimate concern. Let's get down to earth and follow the money to back this up. Once he was, of course, one of the richest men in Europe, but his fortune was gone by the time he reached the late age of 35. We have all heard how, already at age 19, he bought his own ship to cross the Atlantic and join the American Continental Army. Then how he supplied his own troops with uniforms and equipment out of his pocket. He supported the abolition of nobility in 1790, subjecting himself to taxation for the first time. That's an interesting contemporary connection, I think. Ever thereafter, he corrected anyone trying to call him Marquis de Lafayette, an aristocratic title followed by a noble name in 3 words, de Lafayette. And he requested to be addressed only by the title he had earned, General, and followed by a 1-word commoner's form of his name, Lafayette, 1 word. I even brought back from France a facsimile of his calling card, which simply says, Gen. Lafayette. So he was really joining the rest of the human race and was glad to do so. By the calculation of his money manager in 1792, Lafayette had given away almost 5 times his original annual income for the cause of American independence. After returning home from America, he proceeded to spend somewhat more than 5 times that income for the cause of constitutional democracy in France. Along the way, he invested well over another year of his original income in those 3 South American plantations for the sole purpose of offering a model of slave emancipation. When violent Jacobins took power in France by coup in 1792, they seized all his remaining property, short of what he was able to grab and carry on his own person as he galloped over the national border into exile. At the end of the 1790s, Lafayette himself offered a rough summary of where all his fortune had gone. He had spent, he said, 3/5 of it in the cause of liberty. Yeah, he was writing Jefferson at the time. And that left the remaining 2/5, to be confiscated by the Jacobins. But Lafayette surrendered much more than his fortune. He surrendered his security, his freedom, his homeland to the cause of liberty for several years. He risked his life on the battlefields of America, of course, but then also in urban riots as the revolution in France began to take an ugly turn. Eventually, the radical Jacobins called for his head. Within hours of his escape from the guillotine into Belgium in August of 1792, he fell into the hands of forces led by longtime enemies of liberty and national independence, the Prussian king and the Austrian Habsburg emperor. They incarcerated him as a, quote, prisoner of state for what they deemed to be his toxic views, toxic, that is, to the security of their own autocratic governments. For a time, Lafayette was convinced his execution was imminent. The governor of the Austrian Netherlands, a sister of Marie Antoinette, sent him word that the authorities, quote, were keeping him for the scaffold. When he bade goodbye to an aide as he and 2 especially prominent prisoners were separated from the rest of his men after the tribunal, a military tribunal that sentenced him at Luxembourg, he expressed the conviction that even death would not end his work and the values he lived for. It would even promote them. Quote, my blood crying vengeance will bring liberty new defenders. It reminds one of the early Christian martyrs' last words in the Colosseum. His incarceration itself seemed to Lafayette to mimic death, as if he were buried alive. The commandant of the prison at Olmütz, where he spent over 3 years, ordered that his name be replaced by a number. He was to be addressed only as prisoner number 2, and that he be treated, quote, as if he no longer existed and has been forgotten. An open gutter carried sewage under his window from the barracks latrine at the end of the hall. But even at this very low point of his life, Lafayette retained his concern about justice for others. He used gifts and loans from American diplomats to ease conditions for his fellow prisoners. The fate of friends and loved ones back in Jacobin-ruled France became more important to him than his own fate. When he was able to write his wife, as Lloyd pointed out, he asked about the situation of the slaves he had wanted to free on their South American plantations. After a failed rescue attempt, he was anxious above all for his would-be rescuers. He offered his cooperation with military authorities in the hearing that followed the breakout attempt if they would release those would-be rescuers. And he took complete responsibility for the incident on himself. Only after 5 years did the pressure of an international campaign on his behalf, a changed French government, and French victories on the battlefield forced Lafayette's release. It was a release conditioned on Lafayette remaining in exile. For the next 2 years, he lived along the coastal periphery of Northern Europe, depending on loans, handouts, and generous hosts in Hamburg, Denmark, and Holland. Russian involvement in Denmark and then a joint Russian-British invasion of Holland in August 1799 caused him for a while to have nightmares that he might be arrested again and executed or dragged off to a prison in Siberia. Still, he thought of justice for others. He lobbied on behalf of political prisoners still in Austrian hands. He pleaded with the French government to allow his aides to return home, the aides who had followed him into prison, whom he deemed to have been under his orders and completely innocent of his original plan to escape the Jacobins. He tracked the fate of other fugitives and tried to help where he could. As autumn descended a few weeks later, Lafayette found himself in his daughter's cold rental cottage outside the southern gate of a small Dutch town, writing a letter to his wife, Adrienne. In an aside, he reported that he had just sent off his gold repeater watch to a needy friend and fellow exile. He could make do, he surmised, with another cheaper watch. That gold watch was the last of his once glittering fortune. Though he would soon manage to slip back into France, it was a France led by a new dictator, Napoleon Bonaparte, who soon found that Lafayette could not be bribed or manipulated into political cooperation. Lafayette eventually tried to mediate Napoleon's removal from power in 1814-15, became again a public voice for liberty and justice from his position in the French Chamber of Deputies after 1818, helped to remove an autocratic king whom Lloyd mentioned, Charles X, in 1830, and at the end of his life was promoting Polish independence and, yes, women's right to divorce, as Lloyd pointed out. He never let go of his vision. He never gave up hope. He had character that mattered. Well, lessons for our time. I have something very simple. It's simply a citation from John Lewis 2 years ago. Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle for justice is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Very, very nice, nice talk. I now would like to introduce Robert Kraut. Robert teaches history at the College of Charleston in South Carolina. He obtained his PhD from the University of Georgia in 1977. He served as a research historian with Stanley Azerta at Cornell, as well as the resident director in the Lafayette Papers Project. He is associate editor of volumes 3 and 4 of Lafayette in the Age of Revolution, selected letters and papers 1760 to 1790, and co-editor with Mr. Azerta of volume 5. Robert has been studying Lafayette for a substantial part of his professional life. In addition, Robert has likely been an AF member for a longer continuous period than any other living member. Like Grover Cleveland, Robert has served 2 non-consecutive terms as AFL president. So he is he can be called President Emeritus twice. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Robert, who has agreed to share his thoughts on this subject.
Thank you, Alan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Let us say I was not expecting to be in this role at this session until what? 48 hours ago? Whatever it was. So yeah, there are some things that I would like to repeat that the 2 august presenters before me have raised as issues. I would like to invoke the name of someone that Alan raised, and that was related to the study of Lafayette in the 20th century, up until we get into the 1970s. After we get through that period of the of Lafayette past World War I, a period that I think my mentor would have called a hagiographic period, in which everybody is simply acknowledging the wonder of Lafayette and so forth. As we get into that post-World War I cynical generation, the name that emerges is one that's already been mentioned, and that was Louis Gottschalk. I would recall Louis Gottschalk was a grad student at Cornell who was taught by a very prominent historian who, in the last lecture of his history class, one of his students, who went on to be the editor of the Benjamin Franklin papers at Yale, said that as the final words on summarizing the settlement of World War I, he said, it was a world full of fury, signifying nothing. So in the midst of that kind of cynicism that emerged after World War I, we have the appearance of Louis Gottschalk and the idea of saying, can we look at these heroes and also include with them their clay feet? In other words, can we deal with them as human beings with mixed motives? And as a budding young faculty member at the University of Chicago, there seemed to be at that point a lot of I don't know whether you'd call it cynicism, skepticism running through that faculty, particularly in terms of analyzing human nature. And one of those scholars, known for his psychological theory, had essentially said, well, people are the sum total of their experiences. And that for Lafayette, the key experience was the absence of a father, the absence of an authority figure, which therefore led Lafayette into a life of rebelliousness and revolution. And so it was that absence of the traditional father figure in his upbringing that led him to the American Revolution. And Gottschalk was just going to do one volume on Lafayette and then proceed to another French revolutionary figure. The only problem with that was his little first Lafayette volume was so popular that he got tagged with Lafayette for the rest of his career, and he kept getting awards for his work on Lafayette, so he eventually ends up with a whole string of Lafayette volumes that go up to 1790 in Lafayette's life. I'm told somewhere that his secretary had prepared rough drafts of Lafayette's life up to 1792. Never been able to find out whatever happened to those manuscripts, but I'm sure they would be interesting. But if you look carefully at Louis Gottschalk's many volumes on Lafayette, you'll find that, Lafayette appears from point to point as a fairly popular figure. And then all of a sudden there's a sentence or a paragraph that reduces Lafayette to a person seeking fame on the stage. Again, these little interruptions in his book on Lafayette, where he tried to reconcile this new Lafayette and all these other volumes with the Lafayette that he demonstrated in the first one. In other words, Lafayette did not come to the American Revolution for ideals. He came because he was looking for glory. It was a way in which a young officer who had no prospects for advancement in France could gain some glory, some reputation, and push his career along. So, and if we look at Lafayette's first year or so of correspondence, it's a mix of these issues. He talks about American ideals. He's drawn by American ideals, but then to some of his French friends, he's saying, well, at the end of this campaign, I'll be coming back to France and pick up my career. So, we tend to think of history as a group of people who know what the end of the story is. And oftentimes Lafayette is seen as that, as this figure who is determined to say, in America, until independence is reached. And there were very few people in America in those first few years who looked at that. Now, why have I raised this issue of the overwhelming presence of Louis Gottschalk in the interpretations of Lafayette? It is because it's even more important that in 1977, at a conference in France, Clermont-Ferrand, celebrating the bicentennial of the American Revolution, at a conference largely dealing with Lafayette that was held at Clermont-Ferrand, there was a series of papers given there that resulted in a tiny volume that it is very difficult to find these days, including an essay, which is the essay that has launched our entire revision of our view of Lafayette in the years since then. In other words, almost the 50 years since that essay appeared. And that essay by Stanley Itzerda, who had just begun his study of Lafayette as an editor, was entitled Character is Destiny, a new look at Lafayette's career. Now that really is the beginning of our major revision in the latter half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. I know Lloyd and I and Paul, to some extent, have all been affected by Stan's idea. Now, one of the things that I think is important to understand, well, how did Stan come out with a different view than all of these American scholars who were following the Louis Gottschalk view? And that was because as a young man in his teen years, in the late 1930s, Stan had joined the U.S. Navy, and he just happened to be at Pearl Harbor on that fateful day. A day that will live in infamy as much as the 9/11 that was discussed earlier for his generation. And Stan would regale us with stories of the valor, courage, selflessness that he noticed not only at Pearl Harbor, but among an officer corps that oftentimes involved families that had had generations of officers. So in that sense, you see, Stan's new interpretation of Lafayette really brought out a much older view of Lafayette. I would say a view that was consistent with many of the people who actually knew Lafayette and shared his values during his lifetime. Now, some of the points that have been brought up about Lafayette's character, you've really, I think, touched upon the major issues right there. The idea of Lafayette and human rights, Lafayette as a mediator of disagreeing perspectives, Lafayette and his human decency. Those are all, I think, very important issues. I would like to touch upon another point that Paul Spaulding raised just tangentially. And the more I study Lafayette and that early national generation of Americans, the more I'm caught up in this idea of what we can call the early national secular religion of Americans. I think probably the most famous example of that is going to be a group of American intellectuals, theologians that eventually became associated with Unitarianism. But you can see the beginnings of that in some of Lafayette's remarks with George Washington Washington being complimented by Lafayette as the patriarch of liberty. There is this use of Old Testament language, and it ties in with this idea of a new kingdom, not Israel, but the United States as the embodiment of this land of milk and honey, a land of equity, a land of opportunity, and looking at Allen's wonderful translation of Levasseur's account of Lafayette's tour, we see that everywhere. It is that idea that that Lafayette wants not to celebrate. Well, you know, from time to time, yes, he's happy to see old friends. He's happy to be in familiar places. But what really excites him is that realization of the founder's dream. The idea of carving a community out of the wilderness, of building canals to expand America. And to tie in with something that Lloyd said, this idea of Lafayette respecting people of all backgrounds, we do have a lot of situations there where the organizing committees essentially thought they were going to have events for the elite of these communities to honor Lafayette before he moved on. And Lafayette will have none of it. He wants to see everybody. He wants to meet and greet all levels of American society, and where he can, even in those southern states where local authorities have forbidden slaves to be there, Lafayette urges his host to include them. And so there are many situations, let's say, in southern communities where their hero, Lafayette, is caught in a public event embracing slaves, something that would have been unheard of in polite American society, or embracing free blacks in places in the North where that would have been considered as inappropriate behavior. So when Lloyd said that Lafayette was respecting people of all backgrounds, I would add parenthetically, unlike Tocqueville, who simply is encountering the cream of American society. In other words, French aristocracy embracing American aristocracy. And I think, again, this is one of the wonderful things about Levasseur's book, not simply as a past review of Lafayette's speeches, Lafayette's comments, Lafayette's appearances, but going into the history of different colonies, different states, different towns, and talking about how democratic institutions, democratic laws, constitutions, philanthropic societies are established for supporting, sustaining the least of those in those communities. So at some point, I know, Alan, you wanna pull the plug, or what should we do? I would say, you know, one of the things about respecting other people and the point that Paul made about these authoritarian figures like Napoleon, I'm reminded that Napoleon thought he had an agreement from Lafayette that Lafayette, once freed, would leave and go back to America. And of course, Lafayette reneged on that because of the ill health of his wife. So he stayed in Europe and eventually ends up back in France. But one of the things about Napoleon offered to help Lafayette reconstitute his library, all of these things. And it's only later that the punchline comes. What is that? The quid pro quo, that they will reconstitute his library, but that Lafayette is expected to approve Napoleon's election as consul for life. And when Lafayette refuses, that really is the end of Lafayette's public career for a while. But not only that, because Napoleon is so bitter, so revengeful, that he makes every effort to destroy young George Washington Lafayette's military career as a way of getting even. So again, that idea of respecting people of all backgrounds.
Yeah. Robert, I think we're going to have to move on,
Okay.
but thank you very much for your
Sure.
insights.
One of the initial questions is coming from Mr. Strasbaugh, and he said to any of the panelists, which I've enabled you all to unmute, is what was Lafayette's attitude toward the Haitian Revolution? And we do have several questions, so. Did anyone feel comfortable asking or answering or sharing the comment about Lafayette's attitude toward the Haitian Revolution?
Lloyd, do you?
So this is a really interesting question. I have wanted to look into this in more detail. I mean, I know he supported Haitian independence later. He supported Fanny Wright's effort to move emancipated enslaved workers from the United States into Haiti in the 1820s. I have not read the letters in which he talks about the Haitian Revolution. You know, much of that revolution happened while he was in prison between 1793 and 1799. Paul, have you ever seen letters in which Lafayette talks about the Haitian Revolution or
no, I have
or
not.
anything like that?
I have not. It was something that was probably too far afield when he was in prison. He had difficulty getting news that was fresh, and all correspondence was very controlled, all official correspondence. There were things that were slipped into him that the authorities did not know about. But I would have picked up on that if I had seen anything about the Haitian Revolution, and I did not.
Could I add a comment there?
Sure.
Of course, at the very early stages, that is in the initial stage of the revolution, about 1790, 1791, Lafayette is for extended rights, and there are a number of letters, and of course the colonials in Saint-Domingue, who had a society, were very bitter about Lafayette and blamed Lafayette for their troubles. But after 1802, when we get into this period, say 1804, when Dessalines declares himself emperor for life, Lafayette took that as, a Haitian Napoleon. And so Lafayette is not that much involved in it. He is involved in correspondence with another one of his friends who was very interested in what was happening in Haiti, and that was Abbe Sayes. And And then later on, when we get into the 1820s, when there's another generation of leaders in Haiti, uh, a, uh, uh, a, a fellow who styles himself President Boyer, Boyer, Lafayette is so pleased with that that it looks like Haiti is now on the verge of adopting an American style model of a political system, that Lafayette is very supportive of Boyer and his efforts to create more of a democratic society in Haiti. I think one of the things that we tend to forget is that during that interim period, there was actually a lot of racism in that new Haitian republic or Haitian government between blacks and mulattoes. And in that situation, there was an issue of colorism. In other words, that those of African ancestry with lighter skin were favored. And while there really wasn't a state that I would say a formal state of slavery, many of the laborers in that period were in forced slavery. And so I think when Boyer comes on the scene and begins engaging Lafayette in correspondence, Lafayette is, Lafayette's ideals come to the fore. He thinks here's another opportunity for a restart that might result in the emergence of what? A black republic with liberal principles.
So I think it is true in around 1791 when the white residents of Haiti were trying to deny the vote to the free people of color in Haiti, in what was then Saint-Domingue. Lafayette supported the rights of non-white free people to participate in the public sphere. And that was one of his important interventions in the period around 1791.
That's a good segue to another question.
Yeah.
From Mark Holland. How did Lafayette's views on abolition, women's rights, etc., influence his fellow Continental officers? Did it rub off on them or rub them the wrong way? Does anyone have a comment related to that?
Well, I don't think that his view of women's rights was so significant in the period of the 1770s. The period I was talking about is more in the 19th century, when this becomes a more focused element of Lafayette's life. I think he was already, by the end of the Revolution, becoming very critical of slavery, and one of his best friends was Lawrence, what's his name? Henry Lawrence?
John Lawrence.
John Lawrence.
The one who wanted to free all of his enslaved workers and who was killed almost on the last day of a battle in 1783, I think. Right. But I don't think Lafayette was as active in the abolitionist thing, although he worked with James Armistead, during the Virginia campaign, and then he advocated for Armistead's freedom in the 1780s. His abolitionism became much more focused in the 1780s and 1790s.
Right. Hi, Bonnie.
Flipping back to the first part of that, Lafayette was remarkable, but his wife deserves much credit in her unceasing support of her husband, not only in the good times, but in the bad, including in prison, of course. It was she who managed the Cayenne plantation? Was it her life, work, and support that may have prompted Lafayette's support of women's rights? And that was from Patricia Mackley.
Let me just say that he had great respect for his wife, and Paul can tell what about Adrienne during the prison period?
Well, she had been imprisoned by the Jacobins in 2 or 3 prisons, and her grandmother, her sister, her mother were all guillotined. She was on the way to be guillotined, but the American ambassador told the French government, if you do this, you'll lose your last friend. And so she managed to survive. She then took her 2 daughters, managed to get passports to leave the country under the claim that she was going to America. But she went up to Hamburg, which was a seaport up the Elbe River, and she hired a carriage and a bilingual servant driver to take her across Europe with her daughters to Vienna, and she appeared at the imperial court claiming to be a member of the Noailles family, which was the most prestigious French family in the aristocracy behind the royal family itself. The Emperor Francis had never heard of this particular Noailles person, and he thought she was probably someone claiming something she wasn't. But when she got into his presence, she revealed who she really was. And he was really caught by surprise. He was still a young man himself, and he had this sense of chivalry that the aristocracy had grown up with. And although she could not get him to release her husband, she managed to get his permission to have herself and her 2 daughters join her husband in prison. She basically, she could have saved his life, because when she walked through those prison doors, imagine, I mean, he looked skeletal, and he thought he was hallucinating because he had not been forewarned of this. But she really was the person who was bucking him up at his lowest moments, and basically it was her fortune that the family managed to reacquire, and so that Lafayette was able not to go back to a hovel in Paris, but rather to a castle that his wife had inherited east of Paris, Lagrange. So she, in many ways, she was the saving factor in his story during the imprisonment and exile. So yeah, she's a great heroine. She's a great heroine of the French Revolution, no question about it.
No question.
And don't forget the Marquis de Noailles had been the French minister in Vienna. So there was a connection between the Noailles family and diplomatic circles and Austria anyway.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
We have a lot of comments about how much everyone's enjoying the individual remarks and the questions. Thank you very much to you wonderful scholars we have. Another comment about perhaps we can revive Lafayette's example and model today to make it more known and improve our partisan society, especially online. We all wonder how he would take the Twitter world. But back to another question had to do with, a joke. Lafayette was prisoner number 2. Who may have been prisoner number 1? From Joyce.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Maybe Paul would be the best one to.
It's in my book.
Oh yeah.
I think it was there was a prisoner of state from France. I think he was the former prisoner of war or something of that sort, who had already been imprisoned at Olmütz before Lafayette and his 2 fellow prisoners or aides were incarcerated there. So Lafayette was not the first prisoner of state.
Oh, right.
Can I just say one thing about the imprisonment, and Paul is the great expert on this, but in reading Paul's book, I came to understand how formative that prison experience was in Lafayette's life. In that he learned, first of all, that he could survive almost anything. And secondly, I think it deepened his sense of self or character, if we want to use that word. He was always fearless in certain ways, but I think the experience of surviving whatever it was, 6, 7 years in prison, 5 years, I guess it was, wasn't it? That it strengthened him so that even though prison is a horrible thing to go through, no one wants to choose it, it alters your sense of identity and selfhood in a way that is hard to calculate. And I think that's something we need to take into account and why Paul's book is so important. Thank you, Paul.
Well, thank you.
If I could add that it's also in terms of Lafayette's identity as a, again, to go back to my religious analogy, almost as a Pauline character, somebody who is imprisoned for his faith in these principles. And I think the confirmation of that is the number of times, again, when Lafayette is on his tour, when this play, The Prisoner of Olmutz, is shown in different American towns. It becomes the play of choice. Now, to go back to that comment about Lafayette and his relationship with women, don't forget that throughout this formative period of his life, there are very strong women around him. His aunt at Chavignac, and other members of his family who serve as really authority figures until after his mother's death. And in that sense, it is kind of an unusual thing. He doesn't really get that much from the American experience. Remember, Washington and Jefferson were both asked by correspondents to list books for their children. And so they both draw up a list of very scholarly, skilled-related books for the boys, but it's only books for housekeeping and domestic skills for the women. So we can't say it's something that Lafayette got from his American experience, but again, as I said, I think he has it even earlier within his family, this idea of that. And I think there's some speculation with Madame de Tezay, again, one of his close family members, that Lafayette would participate in the salons at her house in the countryside. What's that, Chaville? And so the opportunity to have bright women raising ideas that maybe even men hadn't thought of. And again, this idea that maybe women of intellect ought to have the opportunity. And of course, so Lafayette sought them out. Again, I must say some of the men in France thought his hanging out with young women was questionable purposes, but the correspondence shows he tried to line them up with publishers for their books, for their manuscripts. He tried to line them up with translators if their books needed to be translated into French. So he was very interested in advancing women of intelligence and ideas.
Excellent. Another couple questions. Everyone is very much enjoying this. I know it's hard, you got with everybody on mute, so trust me, this is going great. One of the questions had to do with, do the panelists think that in his early years, Lafayette hated Britain, and that was one of the reasons he wanted to fight in America?
I didn't hear the word there. Lafayette what?
Do the panelists think that in his early years, Lafayette hated Britain, and that was one of the reasons he wanted to fight in America? And just a quick note, it's about 6:20.
Okay, I'll just say very quickly, this is one of the interpretations because his father was killed during the 7 Years' War in a battle against the British.
by a British officer,
Yeah.
Philip, Lord Phillips, the one that he encountered in America, in Virginia.
Yeah, I mean, this is another psychological issue. Why did he hate Britain from such an early age? That's a good, I'm back in now the psychoanalytics here. Maybe he had an unresolved anger and he thought, I'll solve this problem. I'll go to America and work there.
I think, again, one of the major issues, if you look at the last 30 years of his life, there are too many Brits, Englishmen, Scots, Irish, people from the British Isles that Lafayette was very close friends with, if they were liberals and especially if they believed in Republican principles.
Right. And you know, on the floor of Parliament, no less than Cornwallis and Tarleton pleaded with Britain to intervene to help release Lafayette from prison. And, you know, once Frederick the Great sat Lafayette down beside Cornwallis at a dinner thinking this was a big joke, but Cornwallis and Lafayette were immediate friends. They had a great conversation.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there may have been something, a little factor about somehow making up for the loss of his father, but generally he was a very broad-minded, generous person as an adult. So I think he's, you know, Lloyd brought this up. He dealt with every human being without much prejudice. He didn't look at their estate, their nationality, their ethnic background, but he seemed to be able to make connections in a very direct way.
Yes, Carol clarifies.
Especially admired British abolitionists who were taking the lead in the anti-slavery movement at that time. Thomas Clarkson and others. Go ahead, Bonnie. You had another.
Just reading the chat line that, yes, Lafayette liked British people, just not the British state.
Yeah.
That could be.
That could be.
Yeah.
At least until the 1830s when the liberals took over.
Oh, that's a good point.
What about, this doesn't necessarily have to do with the character, but didn't he not get along with Aaron Burr because Aaron Burr had killed Hamilton?
That's a good question.
Hey, let's talk about Hamilton, the musical. I saw recently, and I like the guy. You know, Lafayette. He comes off pretty well in that. That's a good question. I can't believe that he would have particularly liked Aaron Burr, but Robert probably knows more about the letters from that period. I know there was some guy, you know, the guy who helped him. He wrote Jefferson. One of Burr's co-conspirators or something was the guy
Dr. Bowman.
Exactly, who had tried to get him out of prison, right? That's it. He ends up in Aaron Burr's satellite. Yeah.
On his behalf, and Jefferson just struck him down on that one. He says, you know, how could you be?
This guy's a jerk. Don't pay any attention to him. Yeah, and he was connected with Burr. Yeah.
From the panelists, any panelists, has Lafayette been honored by Black scholars and writers, or have they mostly ignored him? Where does anybody have a?
Oh, wow. I think the most outstanding connection there that anybody would make is the professor that taught Martin Luther King Jr. history wrote the little pamphlet of the American Friends of Lafayette on Lafayette and the Negro.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Interesting. Interesting.
Even though we can say that scholar also said, well, I think Dr. King ended up getting maybe a gentleman's C in that history class. So maybe he was more of a maker of history than a reader of history.
That
Excellent.
man's name was Kennedy. I don't remember his first name.
Yeah.
Oops, 1 second.
So could I just point out one other thing? When Lafayette took his tour in 1824-25, he went to the New York School for Black youth. And there was a boy there named James McCune Smith who welcomed him and greeted him. And he was about 11 years old, and he grew up to be one of the first African-American doctors and was a leader in the abolitionist movement and a good friend of Frederick Douglass. And this is a kind of link between Lafayette and the abolitionist movement in the 1850s.
Very good.
And I think this is something that people need to remember when they think about what was Lafayette's legacy. He was an inspiration for people who became abolitionists in the pre-Civil War period.
And there's a similar story there with a young enslaved African in Kentucky who was sitting on a fence when Lafayette passed, and Lafayette turned around and tipped his hat to him. And he recalled later on in life, that was the first time anybody treated me like a human being. And this person went on to become a very prominent figure in the abolitionist movement in the 50s and later on.
Yeah, that's Lewis Hayden in
Yes.
Boston. Yeah.
Let's see.
Does anyone know exactly when the Earth from the U.S. Was brought back to France? Was it 1825 or later? And that's that Earth that is supposed to be in Picpus with Lafayette's grave.
I thought he brought a little back with him, didn't he? This is
No, really. There's some. There was a correspondence in 1829 about getting a keg of earth from Bunker Hill and bringing it back to him. But I've never really been able to trace that down. I think that there was probably a Bostonian who brought it over in 1830 or 31. So there's no record that actually the earth was carried in that effort in 1829. But I think at that point Lafayette was trying to plan for the future.
Yeah.
It would be an odd gift for someone to greet you and say, "Here, I think you'll need this for your burial plot." Maybe it was handled more diplomatically.
Well, I think the man's name was William Walker, and he was a guy who was going around starting libraries for workers, and he enlisted Lafayette's help to try to do that in France. And he's the one who ordered the keg. He was originally from Boston, and there's some correspondence which I think Robert is referring to.
Yeah, he had a title. What was his title? Like Shade of something? He had a title.
Oh, I guess the point being, this keg or cache or whatever it was of soil might have been a bribe to get Lafayette involved in his library project in France, which he was trying to do.
But of course, see, Lafayette really didn't need to be bribed into something like that. Lafayette very much believed in the idea of a movement in France known as what we would call today a public or a subscription library. So in other words, ordinary citizens would be able to have access to books to become well-educated citizens and voters.
All right, Bonnie, how are we doing? We have any more questions? Because we sort of like to wrap it up in the next few minutes if possible.
Well, that's what I was going to say. There are, of course, some great questions and a lot of great comments, and but I just, in case people's time is short, I think we will do our best to be able to post a recording, maybe an edited portion of the recording on our website, so that people were asking about if it is recorded, how will it be distributed. So it's up to you, Alan. There's a couple other questions.
Well, why don't we go for another, until 20 of
Okay.
7. Let's see
Of
what
course,
we can do.
Lafayette is one of our most absolute favorite historical figures to love, to study, and they love listening to all of you teach about him. And comments make, Jane Cote says it makes her love him even more to know that he was helping women authors. I think Robert or Paul was saying, or no, Paul maybe, about why he was fraternizing with those women. It's good to know that Lafayette gave most of his fortune to the American cause and lost the rest in the French Revolution. Jefferson was the one who thought of the way of giving him some money by giving him land in Louisiana when Napoleon sold it, since he never got a dime from the American army during his service. And another question that I thought might spur discussion was, did Lafayette influence Washington in his views of African Americans from the point of Washington not wanting slaves to have anything to do with the Continental Army, or as little as possible to putting in freeing his slaves in his will, agreeing to 1st Rhode Island Regiment, Lauren's idea for a black regiment, etc.? So that's a lot. I can try to restate that if you like.
That's an interesting question. How much did Lafayette really influence Washington's view on the question of slavery?
Right.
I think, you know, there's a famous letter in which he proposed that they should go together and work together to free the slaves by training them. And Washington kind of put him off and never would embrace that idea. I don't know that we could say had a direct influence, but I think he helped to bring out the contradictions that Washington was struggling with. And that was one of the flaws. I think that was the thing that most bothered Lafayette about America, this absolute contradiction of enslavement of black workers and black family. And Washington would not really embrace the ideas that Lafayette put forward.
I think Washington did have some comments in his will about freeing those slaves, but then when it came down to it, I think members of the family would not do that because there was a concern about whether Martha was going to be able to get by during her lifetime. And so they postponed that. And I think that's one of the issues is the American pattern of wanting to keep postponing these big issues till some more appropriate time in the future. And that's what essentially Washington tells Lafayette when he makes that offer, that the time is not right. And actually, there was a proposal that was going to be presented in the Virginia House of Delegates about ending slavery, and it was withdrawn. The other thing, somebody brought up John Lawrence's name as this example of freeing slaves, and John Lawrence had also had proposed during the Revolution in the South Carolina Assembly that slaves who would be willing to fight in the American Revolution would get their freedom when the war was over, and the South Carolina Assembly wouldn't go along with that.
No.
Okay, Bonnie.
I'm communicating with the folks. No, excellent, excellent. Let's see here.
By the way, Robert, the Rhode Island legislature in early 1778 passed such a bill and freed several hundred Native American and African slaves on the condition that they fight in the Revolution. That's the first Rhode Island regiment.
Okay.
Yeah, that was meant.
You know, just the final thing, this was the big problem with Lafayette and Jefferson too, because remember when Jefferson essentially justified the so-called Missouri Compromise and said, well, I think by spreading slavery into the West, it will naturally dissipate. And Lafayette wrote back and said famously, you really think the way to destroy slavery is to spread it to more territories and more people? That was one of the ways Lafayette really challenged Jefferson. And the hypocrisy of Jefferson on that.
Yeah. And the other thing that's related to that is that sometimes we forget it's not just simply the issue of slavery, but the issue of color prejudice. Because one of the points that Lafayette eventually concludes with the Fanny Wright experiment is that it will not be possible to free these in Tennessee, but he goes along with Fanny Wright's idea that they should be moved to Haiti and given their freedom there. And he writes a letter to one of the Southern legislators that says, well, what about Mexico? Mexico is such an ethnically diverse country. Perhaps that would be a place where they could thrive. So, in other words, Lafayette's not an absolute idealist. He's always looking for some way of accomplishing his goals, which I think, again, is one of the basic things about the American Constitution, the idea of compromise. If you can't get everything you want, what can you get? And I think, again, that's one of the skills that Lafayette shows throughout his life.
Okay. Thank you.
So,
I think, yeah, go ahead, Roy.
Alan's a lawyer. Have we made the case that Lafayette had a good character, or do we need? What does the jury say?
Verdict is he did. He had a good character. Well, thank you all panelists for participating, and I'd like to thank our audience too for participating with their questions and listening to us for this long, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And we'll try to do, in these days of the pandemic, we'll try to do this again.
Thank you all. It's nice to see some good old friends.
Thank you so much. Again, I'll try to post this and even put some of those comments. I really appreciate everybody's patience with us.
And thank you to Robert for joining at the last minute.
Yes.
That was a big contribution.
And
Thank you.
thank you all for participating in this. It was great.
Okay.
And I want to thank Bonnie again for